What's on your radar, Batya?
Earlier this month, hundreds of contributors to the New York Times signed an open letter condemning the Times' recent coverage of transgender issues. The letter was addressed to the paper's standards editor and described the contributors' quote, serious concerns about editorial bias in the newspaper's reporting on trans people. The letter took issue with a number of deeply reported pieces the Times had run, including one about people who regret transitioning and another about teachers who hide from parents that their children are transitioning at school. Quote, as thinkers, we are disappointed to see the New York Times follow the lead of far-right hate groups in presenting gender diversity as a new controversy warranting new punitive legislation, the contributors wrote, naming outright those of their colleagues whose work they felt warranted comparison to hate groups. A second coordinated letter from the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, known as GLAAD, along the same lines, was co-signed by a slew of Hollywood types, influencers, and celebutantes. Conservatives reading this may be chuckling to themselves at the idea that the New York Times is viewed by the radical left as a bastion of conservatism, standing athwart puberty blockers and whispering, please slow down just a tiny bit. Indeed, the New York Times is no longer just liberal, as it has been for most of its history. It's woke. As I chronicled extensively in my book, Bad News, the New York Times was at the forefront of mainstreaming what sociologists called the Great Awakening. The infiltration into liberal mainstream of radical academic ideas about race and gender steeped in logical fallacies straight out of French post-war philosophy. Powered by a status revolution among journalists and a business model catering to over-credentialed elites, legacy journalism was captured by a worldview that masks the economic privilege of its adherents by mapping power onto identity categories and valorizing weakness and victimization. Anyone who reads the Times knows this instinctively, but computer scientist David Rosado proved it with data. He created a computer program that scanned the Times online archive from 1970 to 2018 and found that words like racism, white supremacy, traumatizing, marginalized, and hate speech had skyrocketed. His work joined that of political scientist Zach Goldberg, who found a strong correlation emerge between 2012 and 2016 between Google's search interest in race-related topics and the prevalence of stories in the New York Times about racism, privilege, people of color, white tears, white-splaining, structural racism, and slavery. In fact, last week's letter denouncing the Times' coverage of trans issues echoes another letter in which Times contributors and writers protested their colleagues. That letter, sent at the height of the George Floyd riots in 2020, protested an op-ed written by Senator Tom Cotton, which argued that if local police failed to quell rioters and looters, then President Donald Trump should send in the National Guard. Though the op-ed expressed a view held by 58% of Americans and 37% of Black Americans, over 1,000 Times employees signed a letter to the publisher which claimed that the op-ed, quote, undermines the work we do in the newsroom and in opinion and is an affront to our standards for ethical and accurate reporting for the public's interest. Now, that letter was not published, but a huge public campaign on Twitter accompanied it, with the biggest names at the Times tweeting a screenshot of the op-ed with the caption, quote, running this puts Black New York Times staff in danger. The jury is still out on how many who tweeted this actually believed it. In mentioning workplace danger, the tweet deployed language the News Guild of the New York Times insisted was legally protected speech because it focused on workplace safety. Nevertheless, the campaign was effective after what one attendee called a bloodthirsty struggle session of angry, backbiting staffers demanding that heads roll. The New York Times fired James Bennett, its opinion editor. To this day, a vast and embarrassing editor's note is attached to the op-ed. So, given this history, it was surprising when, instead of caving to the pressure from last week's letter on trans coverage, Times leaders excoriated the signatories. Quote, we do not welcome and will not tolerate participation by Times journalists in protests organized by advocacy groups or attacks on colleagues on social media and other public forums. Executive editor Joseph Kahn and opinion editor Kathleen Kingsbury wrote in an email, quote, participation in such a campaign is against the letter and spirit of our ethics policy. Now, the Guild asserted in a letter journalists' right to criticize the paper over, quote, workplace conditions. Yet a group of high-profile New York Times journalists fired back, insisting that, quote, factual, accurate journalism that is written, edited, and published in accordance with Times standards does not create a hostile workplace. Every day, partisan actors seek to influence, attack, or discredit our work. We accept that, the letter reads. But what we don't accept is what the Guild appears to be endorsing, a workplace in which any opinion or disagreement about Times coverage can be recast as a matter of workplace conditions. Where was this backbone, one wonders, this understanding of the role of journalism and the importance of debate and viewpoint diversity back in that long time ago of 2020? What changed that allowed the Times to rediscover that opinions people don't like are not unsafe workplace conditions, indeed, are integral to good journalism? The New York Times is less a leader of opinion and more a bellwether for what it's safe to say in affluent upper-crust liberal circles. And apparently it's now safe to admit that people who detransition exist, that some are miserable, and that many are mortified at what's being allowed to be done to children. This, too, isn't just a feeling. There's quantitative evidence, again from David Rosado, that the Great Awakening is winding down. Starting in 2012, victim narratives had been correlated strongly with positive terminology on Twitter, but the trend seems to have peaked and is now on the downswing. To what do we owe the end of the chokehold wokeness had on elite liberal discourse? To me, it seems clear that it was the rejection by mainstream Black Americans of woke ideas like defund the police, or the idea that marginalized people of color are somehow never able to overcome their marginalization. Black Americans are similarly not on board with trans extremism. And this rejection also explains the progression in leftist activist circles from a moral panic around race to one around trans issues over the past 3 years, represented by this tale of two letters. And in a way, it also explains how the Times found its backbone. The average American believes racism is terrible and wants to be as far as possible from any association with it. The average American, 64% of us, also wants transgender people to have protections in the workplace and against housing discrimination. But they do not agree with New York Times activists that it is bigotry to question children transitioning or trans women competing on girls' sports teams. The moral panic around race was much more intensive and destructive than the one around trans issues is shaping up to be, for the simple reason that racial oppression was real for much of our history, and racism still exists in some corners of American life, though thank God not many are left. There is at least a reasonable argument to be made that the burden of proof falls on those arguing that racism is no longer the threat it used to be, and not on those who can't see the progress, especially in the weeks and months following a video like that of George Floyd's murder. This is not to justify the Times' craven cowardice in the face of the moral panic of 2020, but to explain it, to explain the terror someone might have felt for publicly dissenting, though some had the courage to do so even then. Michael Powell, for example, who wrote a counter letter supporting Bennett. But when it comes to the transgender issue, especially regarding children making irreversible changes to their bodies that in some cases prevent sexual pleasure and the possibility of having their own children for life, the burden of proof that allowing this is the civil rights cause rather than preventing it falls to those encouraging medical intervention on behalf of a very new and socially contagious phenomenon that we know is correlated in many cases with a mental health crisis. And the activists on this issue simply have not yet met the burden of proof. It was about time the New York Times found its backbone. Here's hoping they keep it. So, Robbie, have you been following this whole letter and the brouhaha around it?
Yes, of course. And I was very pleased to see the New York Times defend itself, really, defend its own reporting on this subject, which I think has been pretty good, especially as of late. The reporting has not been at all anti-trans people or condemning of trans people or at all on board with the policy aims of Republicans on this issue in many places. It simply pointed out that a lot of this science is new and unsettled, and very importantly, that peer countries of ours that were a little bit more encouraging and permissive of what young people were able to do in terms of gender care are now rethinking some of that. And that is, I think that's notable. It's fine to report on that. It's fine to talk to people who've had it and regretted it or wanted to have it and didn't end up having it and are glad that was the outcome. Without, that is not a sweeping condemnation. That's not saying it's wrong for everyone. I would just like there to be a lot more investigating and making sure that this is the best thing and healthiest for the kids who signal that they want to pursue it, and it's not for social reasons or for something else. And I'm not going to sit here and say they can't do that, but there needs to be at least a little bit more probing or questioning or interrogating of if this is the best thing for the vast majority of people, of young people who walk through those clinic doors. And I don't know if you read that really terrifying piece. I thought it was terrifying, at least for the Free Press, for Bari Weiss's journalism project, by someone who worked in a gender clinic. And this person was saying she affirms transgender people. She chose to work there because she thinks the work is important. But she said over time, she has seen a lot of people coming through the doors, young people. It used to be mostly young men. Now it's much more so young women, and they all come from the same high school at the same time, and they're all, they can have one visit, and all of a sudden they're down the path towards some things that cannot be corrected, that are permanent. And she thinks it's way too hasty. There's not enough interrogating if whether that's the best thing for these young people. Not saying they can't have it, but it needs to be interrogated, and it's not happening, which is exactly what many people are worried about, many families and parents are worried about. So the idea that you wouldn't be able to report on that is frankly ridiculous. So good on the New York Times for standing up for itself.
Absolutely, and hope to see more of this from lots of other outlets following their lead now that they've broken the taboo on it. And we will have much more rising right after this.